Good morning. The commission is called to order. We have one quick business matter to attend to, and seeing that we have a quorum, I move that the commission adopts the 2025 annual report and recommendations to Congress before us today.
I second the motion.
Hearing no objections? No objections? The annual report and recommendations are officially adopted by the commission. Okay, so now let's get down to business. And good morning and welcome to the release of the U.S.-China Commission's 2025 annual report to Congress. I am pleased to share once again a unanimous report. Our unanimity reflects the Commissioner's commitment to providing Congress a bipartisan approach toward China policy. I would like to thank the many witnesses, experts, and government officials with whom the Commission consulted throughout the year. I'd also like to thank the Commission staff for their outstanding and tireless work on this report. And I would like to thank my colleagues on this Commission for their collective insight and commitment to our mission. The challenges to U.S. interests posed by China are complex, manifold, and rapidly evolving. Building consensus and proposals for legislative action requires dedication, discernment, and collegiality. It is an honor to work with all of you. Our report this year offers 28 recommendations across technology, economics and trade, and national security. We look forward to briefing members and committees of Congress over the coming weeks and months on our material. Our 2025 report examines how China has used industrial policy at unprecedented scale to position itself to attain first-mover advantage in the technologies of the future. At the conclusion of its Made in China 2025 industrial plan, China now possesses a hypercharged, state-directed industrial commons for manufacturing without historic parallel. China has captured crucial intermediate manufacturing processes that help keep its companies at the center of the global value chains. Without swift and focused action, the United States could face a future where we depend on China for access to the most cutting-edge innovations in fields from medicine to robotics. At the same time, China's broader economy continues to experience malaise and structural weakness due to years of broken promises to rebalance. China's leaders have made clear their primary economic goals are to move up the value chain and reduce dependence on foreign technology. President Xi has also been explicit that he wants to make the world more dependent on China. So we can expect that China will continue massive distortionary policy support for strategic sectors, even if that means slower growth elsewhere in its economy. This results in a two-speed economic model of industrial overinvestment even as the broader economy stagnates. China relies on the rest of the world to absorb the excess production caused by its overinvestment and is on track to set a new record trade surplus of over $1 trillion in 2025, breaking its own record set just last year. This massive outpouring of exports, which we call China Shock 2.0, threatens both advanced and developing economies. A flood of subsidized Chinese electric vehicles is undermining export markets for automakers in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. At the same time, China is directing a deluge of low-cost manufactured goods to developing countries, causing factory closures and layoffs. We heard a lot about this problem during our trips this past year to Southeast Asia. In 2025, China leveraged U.S. supply chain vulnerabilities to chilling effect. Beijing used its monopoly over critical mineral refining to impose export controls on rare earth elements and magnets essential to a range of manufacturing industries and defense technologies, and used this leverage in trade negotiations with the United States. While they have recently relaxed some of these restrictions, Beijing is also tightening its enforcement capabilities for the future. We can be sure China will be ready to weaponize these choke points again when politically advantageous. Critical minerals are only one example of China's supply chain leverage. Our report highlights how Beijing could weaponize other choke points to devastating effect. Chinese producers wield significant control over active pharmaceutical ingredients and key equipment used in the U.S. electrical grid, and they are investing heavily to gain such leverage over foundational semiconductors. U.S. reliance on China creates a dangerous dependence that China can weaponize if it wants to. The United States needs to address these vulnerabilities urgently and with a long-term commitment to resources. I want to call special attention to one issue. We released our first commission spotlight on this issue a few months ago. I'm talking about the scourge of scam centers operated by Chinese crime syndicates in Southeast Asia. Scam centers are both a pocketbook and national security issue. They are defrauding Americans out of billions of dollars annually. Beijing is also exploiting the crisis to embed its domestic security forces in some Southeast Asian countries. While China has helped crack down on scammers targeting Chinese citizens, this has just incentivized the criminal networks to target the United States. Some of the criminal organizations behind scam centers even have ties to Chinese officials. The Commission has a detailed recommendation about ways which Congress can help address the scam center crisis as well. I will now turn to Vice Chair Shriver.
Thank you, Chair Price, and I know I can speak on behalf of my fellow commissioners in expressing appreciation for your leadership over this year's annual report cycle, and very much appreciate your dedicated leadership in helping produce this report. I also like to thank my fellow commissioners and witnesses, and also join you in thanking the staff for all the tremendous work that went into producing this report. Over the past year, Beijing's talking points have portrayed China as a force for global stability, but as the report documents, China is anything but and is engaged in a range of destabilizing activities that threaten the very international order it proclaims to uphold. We're very clear-eyed about China's growing capabilities. They're advancing military capabilities very rapidly, including the introduction of new capabilities, such as self-propelled landing barges, the world's largest amphibious ship, and hypersonic missiles that could target U.S. forward-deployed forces. Their growing capabilities are just one part of the story. They also continue to act very aggressively in the gray zone, particularly in the Taiwan Strait area and the South China Sea. For example, around Taiwan, Chinese incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone have increased 15,000% over 5 years, from only 20 in 2019 to over 3,000 in 2024. And they're on pace for even more incursions in 2025. China is also behaving very aggressively in the South China Sea and targeting the Philippines. A number of incidents have occurred, including the near fatal incident of a Philippine mariner. And obviously, these activities could trigger the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. Our report focused in particular areas of advancement in Chinese capabilities. We took a close look at China's whole-of-government strategy to become a preeminent space power. The PLA's expanding arsenal of space capabilities are a direct threat to U.S. national security, and they multiply China's combat capabilities. We also looked at the access of autocracies and had a hearing on the subject, featuring China's relationship with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. China continues to support Russian activities in Ukraine. In fact, Russia would be hard-pressed to sustain the conflict without Chinese economic and material support. China's deepening cooperation with Russia, Iran, and North Korea also increases other risks, such as the risk of opportunistic aggression. So we not only need to think about particular contingencies, such as a potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait, but the possibility of multiple acts of aggression simultaneously that could stress our forces. China's been working to cement its hegemony in regions like Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands, another area of of close examination in our report this year. After decades of systematically expanding its economic pressure in these regions, Beijing is now wielding its economic leverage to secure greater military access and security influence. As Chair Price mentioned, we traveled to the region this year, including Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and we observed firsthand how China's overcapacity and economic posture is affecting these countries. In many cases, they're having different effect across the region, but one unified message is that our interlocutors would like to see deeper economic and security engagement from the United States. So our report offers a number of policy recommendations of how we can maintain deterrence and preserve primacy in key domains such as space, as well as bolstering our relationships in key regions like Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And we look forward to discussing these recommendations with members and staff in the coming weeks and look forward to your questions today.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So at this point, I think we can open up the panel for questions. If anyone would like to have questions. Jameson? Yeah.
We did receive some questions from online in advance of the event today, so we can read one of those while those in person think of their questions. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yes, we have the first question from online, but first, if you are watching online, you're able to submit live questions at contact@uscc.gov. The first question that we've already received online is, do you think China's massive and distortionary industrial policy is sustainable in the long run?
Who would like to jump in and answer that question?
It depends on whether we do anything about it. One of the major problems is that it has been years that China has doubled down on its model, and then it's doubled down again, and it's doubled down again. One of the focuses from our final hearing of the year was about China Shock 2.0, in which case we really dug into the idea behind China's economic strategy, which is more production and more export and more market share of products around the world. If there is no international pushback, then yes, this model can go on indefinitely as China gains more and more market share, as the overproduction, overcapacity from China ends up causing a export of deflation, which ends up eviscerating industries in our country and those of our allies and partners. So first and foremost, we need to be thinking about how we can put a brake on this economic strategy, which we've seen for several different years. And despite the fact that we've articulated, there's been a tariff plan, there's been trade policy pushback from around the globe, there has not been a change in policy from Beijing. If you look at what's been happening the last several years, it's been Beijing continuing to double down on this policy. So I think the answer to this is we need to get very serious, because we can complain all we want, but if there's not smart policy pushing back on this, then this will last deep into the future.
Aaron?
Yes, I just wanted to highlight Commissioner Miller's points. Two things that China needs from the rest of the world. It's been very successful in certain respects, and our report talks about that, but they're not self-reliant as they say they want to be. They depend on the rest of the world for demand or markets, and they also depend on the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, for certain kinds of advanced technology. And to the extent that they are able to continue to access those things, to offload all of this excess capacity, to continue to import the technology they need to move up the ladder and improve their capacity for innovation, their model can succeed, or it can continue to function for quite some time. So the notion that China has peaked or is going to hit the wall, it may be true in the long run, but there are no indications of that happening anytime soon. Again, as Commissioner Miller says, it depends in part on what we do.
I would, first of all, agree with what Commissioner Miller and Commissioner Friedberg have said. The other thing I would say, this is just an observation, is China has little regard for the amount of debt that it is racking up, and it is determined to lead, as it calls it, the next industrial revolution. And as long as that continues to be their strategic objective, debt be damned, they're marching ahead, I think, is the Commission's sort of assessment this year.
Yeah, and just to echo that point, I think the PRC is willing to endure a lot of pain to their own domestic markets and domestic employment numbers in order to gain these advantages in the international competitive space.
If no one else wants to jump in, next question.
Yep, I think we have another question from online.
Great. The next question from online comes from Mark Matthews. Could you address China's rise to a top spot internationally in scientific research, as measured by the Nature Index and the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation?
I'm not sure about the two indexes that were referenced by Mr. Matthews, but I'll say that China's year over year increasing its investment in science technology by about 6 or 7%. I think that is a staggering amount. And as we continue to see these investments, we should continue to expect to see innovation. And we're seeing that every day in the biotech space. We're seeing it every day in the quantum space, two areas where the Commission spoke to at some length. And so I'm sure those indexes, if I was familiar with them, would sort of say like this is all about trend lines. And the trend line that we're seeing in China is exponential in a lot of spaces. And in the United States, investment is sort of plateauing, and that we're doing it at exactly the wrong time would be my assessment.
There are various measures that people use to assess China's capacities in scientific development, research and development, and innovation, but almost all of them point in the same direction. They differ in part about the degree. There's another that's worth looking at put out by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which identifies a number of high-tech sectors and assesses who is in the lead as measured by research output. And there's been an inversion, basically, of the positions of the United States and China over the last 20 years. So there may be differences about the specifics. There's no question, I think, about the direction.
Hey, thank you so much for being here, Commissioners. Harrison Waters, World News Group. Could you talk a little bit more about China's promises to come in with aid and trade where the U.S. has pulled out or imposed tariffs as cut aid, especially Africa, Southeast Asia? Is China following through on some of those promises they made earlier in the year, or are they continuing to kind of hold out empty words on those fronts?
Who wants to jump in?
I can
Okay,
jump
go
in.
ahead.
Thanks for that question. I think we focused on Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands this year. And what we found is that China is certainly exploiting the fact that the United States has dismantled its foreign assistance and its media programs in the region. To the extent that China is backfilling that, we haven't seen that as much, but certainly on the media side, China has a very robust media program, and one of our major recommendations is that the Congress should restore Radio Free Asia as soon as possible to get information into China, but also get information about what China is doing in China and throughout the world.
Oh, head.
Yeah, one thing I'd add on top of that is, in addition to the recommendation that was just highlighted, as the U.S. has sort of made this shift and things have become more sort of settled, we've seen sort of the U.S. prioritize economic engagement and partnerships in these regions, and that's actually been something that the regions have responded very well to. And so it's, again, shifting a little bit from sort of the traditional model of foreign aid and actually prioritizing business development. And that's something that, again, we're seeing kind of it's in its infancy right now, but the administration is kind of pushing in that direction. We touched on sort of the advantages of having those types of partnerships and alliances throughout the report. And so, again, we think that kind of is providing some sort of counterbalance there.
Next.
Hi, I have a few questions on the matter of Taiwan. One of the key findings on Taiwan says that a PLA can implement a blockade within a matter of hours and will potentially need only minimal conversion time prior to an attack. I'm just wondering, do we have a more specific time frame on that? And what signs would indicate when an attack or a blockade would happen? And I've seen some alarming date like 2027, 2035, and 2049. I'm just wondering, is 2049, could we say that 2049 is the ultimate date for invasion, or how sure are we on these dates? Thank you.
Well, let me start with the second question first. What the Chinese leadership has said about 2049, Xi Jinping himself has said, is that the great project of national rejuvenization will be completed by 2049, and that the, in their words, the reunification with Taiwan is an essential part of great national rejuvenization. I think their preference is to win without fighting, and I don't know that we could necessarily say that's a sort of ultimatum and will attack by date, but the language of their intention is pretty clear. I would say with respect to 2027, again, it's more a statement of capability than an actual go date. So Xi Jinping's directive is that the PLA be prepared by 2027, but that's a statement of capabilities, not necessarily a date that one should expect kinetic military activity. In terms of the capabilities associated with a blockade or actual attack, a soft blockade, a lawfare type move could be done essentially with no warning. They could declare missile closure areas, exercise closure areas, and likely people would be forced to respect that in terms of traffic coming in and out of major ports. But a physical blockade, moving assets into position to be able to enforce a blockade, would also be relatively quick and easy for them to do if they chose to do, given their daily posture now. There's naval activity, PLA Navy, PLA Coast Guard, maritime militia, all around Taiwan, to include on the eastern part of Taiwan. That's very routine, so moving in position to enforce a blockade could be done very quickly. The point of the question about an attack and warning time, we're losing warning time. And Admiral Paparo has said that Chinese activities look not so much like exercising as it does rehearsal. And I think what he means by that is these aren't just moves to exert pressure and have presence to make a point. They're actually rehearsing certain aspects of a amphibious invasion, communication links, logistics support, et cetera. So that all decreases warning time significantly if they choose to take the step of going from coercion to actual attack.
I would put a little sharper edge on it than Commissioner Shriver would, which is that China has basically spent the better part of the last decade boiling the frog of the status quo in the Straits. And we're seeing that every day. And what Commissioner Shriver just sort of walked you through, which is the exercises to rehearsal posture, has dramatically changed things on the ground.
Just one other factor to mention, which the Chinese clearly take very seriously, is the question of the credibility of the American commitment to assist Taiwan in the event of aggression. And China has played on questions of American commitment for some time, and they've done more of that recently and tried to cultivate doubt. It's part of this effort to win without fighting, to undermine the resolve of people on Taiwan to resist.
Hi, just want to know, we know the latest development of the Chinese government and the Japanese Prime Minister. We know it's not included in the report, but I just wondering if any of you can comment on the best strategy that Japanese government or the U.S. government can do with regard to this matter and how it might affect the, the closer relations in Taiwan Strait. Thank you.
The statement by the Chinese Consul General in Osaka is absolutely outrageous, particularly in light of the political assassination of Shinzo Abe very recently to actually threaten the life of the Prime Minister is outrageous. Japan's government is perfectly capable of making decisions on how to address that without advice from any of us, but it seems to me it should be disqualifying for future office in Japan, for sure.
And let me just say that throughout the report, underpinning every recommendation is the strong relationship, continuing the strong relationship between the United States and our allies and partners, especially Japan. And how important that is, especially when you have this axis of autocracy and you have China working closer with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others, and how important that is. And so to the extent that the U.S. has the strongest possible response in support of Japan is important.
Thank you. So based on the discussion, I wonder how the Commission assess the possibility and implication of including Taiwan in the RIMPAC exercise. Do you have any thought about that? Thank you.
Well, the report does not address it specifically. I think we've seen the U.S. engage in more training activities with Taiwan, both in country and also having Taiwanese units train in the United States. I have a personal opinion on this, which is I think RIMPAC is a large international exercise that is at a very sort of basic level of operation. We sort of trim down to the lowest common denominator, and it's a very large exercise with many countries. I would prefer to see more training and exercise bilaterally with the U.S. and Taiwan that would be more dedicated to the types of military challenges Taiwan faces, and perhaps even trilateral or multilateral with countries in proximity to where a contingency might be, so Japan, Philippines, et cetera. So again, personal opinion, not something that the Commission addressed specifically.
Next.
If there's no questions from the audience for the time being, I can come in with another online question. Most people in Pacific Island countries do not want to be forced to choose sides in U.S.-China competition and do not want to be treated as pawns in that competition. Is there a risk that by framing our relationship with the Pacific Islands through the lens of U.S.-China competition, we might end up alienating the very people we want to win over?
Sure, I can try to answer that. Well, I mean, what you've seen is that over the last 2 decades, China has increased its influence and its economic influence in the Pacific Island countries. As far as the U.S. strategy, I think our recommendations that we've put forward in this report, expanding our assistance to expanding our support for the Coast Guard and our relationships, and maybe even compacts of foreign assistance with with free association with countries in the Pacific Islands is absolutely important. We don't have to make this question between the U.S. and China. It's just the U.S. should try to expand its influence in the Pacific Islands for our own national security relative to China or any other challenge we have.
What I'd add on top of that is this is a question of values, behavior, and stated policy goals. What we're pushing forward today and the discussions we've had over the past year emphasize prioritizing long-term benefits for the region and for the United States. This isn't us asking them to choose, it's asking us to look at the actual behavior of the CCP, the long-term values and policy goals, and deciding what they want to be a part of.
Hi, Estelle Atkinson, Global Investigations Review. So one of your recommendations was to create a unified economic statecraft entity in order to modernize the U.S.'s approach to countering evasion tactics. And I was just hoping you could elaborate on what it is about this moment that mandates a more cohesive effort to protect American technologies and what that would ideally look like in practice.
I'll start off, and I'm sure some other commissioners will want to chime in. I think the conclusion that we came to over the course of this year and probably a little bit last year is that we essentially have a number of organizations across the executive branch that have critical roles in the sanctions ecosystem and in the export control ecosystem. And honestly, in the larger sort of financial ecosystem as it relates to sort of outbound investment in a variety of other areas. And what often happens in this ecosystem is that you essentially have the equivalent of feudal states arguing over what they believe to be the most important or the most critical thing to do. And there's not a natural way to bring these sort of issues to a head inside of the interagency. And so the Commission's recommendation is consolidating these entities basically to take these factions and put them in one place so you can have a forcing function to drive decisions in a process that is becoming more and more important as we think about what the next 10, 15, and 20 years look like, and how we can align the executive branch in a way that makes more sense in terms of implementing economic statecraft in a truly dynamic environment that is really going to be sort of vital to this conflict with China.
I think we also need to be open-eyed about the structural disincentives we have in this current system. If you look at the way that sanctions or export controls are managed in the U.S. government, in the Commerce Department, is in charge of promoting American business, but an undersecretary and assistant secretary would be in charge of export controls, which is in some ways counter to the mission. The Treasury Department is, in charge of cementing financial stability, whereas an assistant secretary and undersecretary might be in charge of the sanctions in that building. One of the reasons that we think it's necessary in order to break this out is so that national security, we've been fighting the last war. What we need to do is be very open-eyed about what our competition with China involves. It involves the need to have export controls alongside trade and investment restrictions and other key pillars. And as a result, we need to make sure that the agency, the department, the individuals who are in charge of implementing these sanctioned and export control policies are in an integrated mechanism that is incentivized to prioritize national security and above other interests.
Let me just add one thing that I neglected to mention, which is one of the things we did after 9/11 with the sanctions community is we integrated the Treasury Department into the intelligence community. And the consequence of that, and it was a positive consequence, was that we started to see that the sort of flash to bang on sanctions entities being identified and enforcement actions being taken became more rapid. The Department of Commerce, and certainly not the Bureau of Industry and Security, are not part of the intelligence community. And so one of the core pieces of the recommendation is that as we think about this single entity, one of the things we really do need to change is making sure that that Bureau of Industry and Security and all of its sort of equities, both sort of the enforcement side and the analytics side, are incorporated into the intelligence community. Why is that important? The biggest thing you can do as a member of the intelligence community is you can drive collection requirements. And being able to drive collection requirements means you're going to get answers, essentially answers to your questions. And so as you think about a single entity and you think about how does it truly start working quickly and rapidly from both an analytic perspective and an enforcement perspective, is making sure it has the sort of the feedstock, the intelligence feedstock, the lifeblood to sort of get that program going.
Hi, Ria Jain, National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology. It seems that a lot of the report touches on a number of emerging technologies, from AI to biotech to quantum computing. But today, China pumps out even more STEM PhD graduates than the United States does. How do we compete with China's larger population size and investment over the past 20 years to continue to lead the world in these technologies? Is it inevitable that they lead, or do we have an alternative strategy to combat that? Thank you.
Two pieces of the American system for promoting innovation, certainly since the end of the Second World War, have been support for basic science, which means in part support for universities, and also openness to immigration and people with talents and abilities, experts in various fields, or people who want to come and train here in those fields, and encourages them to stay. Those are two critical aspects of the policies that have gotten us to the position of leadership that we still have. But if they're abandoned, or if they're allowed to wither, our position is going to erode.
Ria, thank you for the question. And since I know you're a biotech enthusiast, I want to take the opportunity to sort of highlight one recommendation that we have on biotech. And I think that Leland probably wants to Commissioner Miller wants to highlight the other one. Biotech is probably the most critical technology area for the United States to think about right now. Obviously, the work of your good commission did an incredible job of increasing bioliteracy and shining a light on that. There are a few things that need to happen in biotech for that to happen. The biggest one is sort of a strategic investment in biotech with a view towards unlocking biotech as a general purpose technology. How should we think about that? Well, when the United States unlocked chemistry and physics as a general purpose technology, you essentially learn how to program in that science. There's no such capability in biotech to do that right now. One of the things that we need to think about when we look at it is, what are the weights and measures of biotech right now? We don't know what they are. And so one of the recommendations is to create a bio measurements laboratory and start thinking about what are the watts, what are the joules, what are the bits, what are the atoms, I think one of our witnesses said earlier this year, as we think through that ecosystem. And then there are two other things we recommended. One is taking the USDA, or the U.S. Department of Agriculture's bio-preferred program, and sort of putting it on steroids, finding ways to breathe more life into that program and figure out how we can sort of create markets for a lot of the companies that exist in this ecosystem. And then the other piece is the Department of Energy has this incredibly powerful program called the Loan Program Office. And they do all kinds of good work, and making sure that they do more in the biotech space is something that we think is sort of vital to making sure this ecosystem sort of gets up and running.
When we're talking about economic security strategies vis-a-vis China, one of the things we want to make sure we're doing is we're not providing Beijing the capital or the technological inputs to build their technological dominance or their war machine. But the other side of this is we need to be very we need to be very careful that we understand our own vulnerabilities, particularly in terms of leverage that Beijing may have over the U.S. economy and the economies, the supply chains of our economy and our allies. One of the things that we did is a deep dive into pharmaceuticals as a potential choke point for the U.S. economy. We did months and months and months of research on compiling all the data, and when we were done, we realized we barely had enough data to do anything more than make ranges on the level of vulnerability that we had in these supply chains. There is some direct vulnerability in terms of what the pharmaceuticals that Beijing sends directly to the United States, but behind the scenes, the issue is much more murky and much more worrisome, because the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into these drugs are created in large part in China, and we don't have good data on that. And when you look at the key starting materials that go into those active pharmaceutical ingredients, we have even less data on that. So a lot of the time when we talk about getting drugs or medications, other things from India, for instance, a lot of the original inputs to that medication, to those pharmaceuticals, came from China originally. How much? We don't know. So one of the most important things we can possibly do as we try to formulate a policy that is trying to create more supply chain resilience around key sectors like pharmaceuticals, like biotechnology, is to get the data that we need. And what we don't have right now are the data we need to understand the extent of the vulnerability we have to Chinese supply chains and to Beijing's leverage points over these supply chains.
I would also just sort of highlight the work we did on foundational chips. This is another area where we had a hearing, Supply Shock 2.0. When Leland talks about the data, it goes well beyond biotech. It extends into things like legacy chips. And these are things that literally look around this room. Anything with a switch on it has a legacy chip on it. Look at your iPhone. That has an advanced chip on it. These legacy chips are in your toaster oven at home. They're in your blender at home. They're in the light switches. And so as we think about supply chains, we do have to think about where are all the vulnerabilities that we have, and what is the data that we do have, and what is the data we don't have, and how do we think about this in a thoughtful way?
Just to add on to that, I completely agree. This CCP has systematically built leverage across the supply chain, whether it's pharma, critical minerals, energy infrastructure, biotechnology, or chips. And this has been intentional. It's been well documented. We do need more data. I completely agree. But there's also an aspect of this that I think gets sort of glossed over, and it goes directly back to your question, and that is, can the U.S. compete? absolutely, the United States is built to compete, we're built to innovate, and we can out-innovate, but we have to start prioritizing it and doing it at scale. We're doing it right now in small pockets, but one of the things the commission heard from folks agnostic of the issue was that the clock is ticking on each of these issue areas, and we need to start actually delivering results within the United States to produce scale.
Hi, thank you. Quick question on this supply chain. So you guys mentioned that, quick question on the supply chain. So recently we heard Treasury Secretary Bison mentioned that we want to decouple. We want to de-risk, not decouple, especially in the rare earth side. But how long, so what's the realistic timeline on that? Because we know that China's dominance on that, it's been decades in the making. So is there like a realistic timeline on that? Because the 1-year extension they just gave is not going to be enough. So I won't be surprised like they're going to play the same card again at the end of it. And the second is the second question is, we all see that China is increasing purchasing gold in the past, especially 2 years, as an attempt to de-dollarize. And what's your view on that?
The rare earth export controls that were extended to extraterritorial authority by the Chinese a number of weeks ago should not have been a surprise to any of us. This is something that the leadership has been talking about and working on for a long time. It's not something now that Beijing has announced it and put into play that they will ever trade away. They will push pause on it. They will turn the volume up or down, but they will not ever trade it away. Over time, they'll get better at enforcing it, and they will extend it in all likelihood to other sectors that we're focusing on, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's foundational semiconductors, whether it's printed circuit boards, other issues that we should be worried about. So I think the most important thing here is to realize that this is a part of the conversation now. And this is enormous leverage that Beijing is simply not going to trade away. The message should be loud and clear in the United States and to allies and partners that we need to do something about it immediately and quickly. The timeline on this, I don't think anybody knows. I would assume more than 2 years, hopefully less than 10 years. But it's not just about sourcing critical minerals, for instance. It's about the processing that goes along with it. The Trump administration has leapt into action on this. There have been a number of different deals, both domestically and with our allies in Australia, developments in Malaysia. Obviously, Mountain Pass was a major development domestically in which the United States government not only took what was essentially an equity stake, but also put a price floor to say, this is not an economic issue anymore. This is a national security issue, and we are going to get where we need to go, regardless of what the economics are and regardless of what price pressures Beijing wants to put on this industry. I think that's the right way to go. The question is always, are we doing it fast enough? And hopefully the answer is going to be yes. So we did not deal with gold in the report, but I could say that Beijing has interest in, of course, in diversifying away from the US dollar at the margins. The reality is that Beijing cannot diversify away from the US dollar outside the margins. So there'll be more buying of gold, there'll be buying more of perhaps other government debt, et cetera. But the reality of the relationship is that the Chinese government is going to be backstopping its own economy with the US dollar in the short term, in the medium term, and likely the longer term. And the gold is sort of a sideshow to all this.
One point on that, although there has been minimal progress towards de-dollarization for exactly the reasons that Commissioner Miller mentions, and it's likely that the dollar will remain the dominant medium of exchange and store of value in the international economic system. But there's another issue where China has made some significant progress, and that's development of alternative payment systems that enable China to continue to do business with partners outside the dollar system, which they've built up as a way of limiting their exposure to sanctions, to financial sanctions. And they are now doing a significant portion of their trade through those payment systems and avoiding the dollar system. So it's not getting away from the dollar, but it is limiting their vulnerability to sanctions. And there are a number of countries like Russia that welcome the opportunity to conduct their business in that way for the same reason.
Commissioner Friedberg brings up a very good point. There's actually a paper that we just put out on sanctions evasion, export control evasion that I'd recommend everyone just take a look at. It highlights a lot of the things that Commissioner Friedberg just highlighted. The thing I would go to on your question is that this actually reinforces, Commissioner Miller's comments reinforce sort of the first recommendation of the Commission this year, which is this economic statecraft model. There are so many elements of the government that play a vital role in this. They have the authorities they need, but they're sort of in a fragmented state across the U.S. government. And as we think about all the things that Commissioner Miller just talked about, we have to think about how are we organizing for what is undoubtedly a multi-decade sort of state of persistent changes in the equilibrium as it relates to export controls, sanctions, critical minerals, and other areas that are sort of the lifeblood of the innovation ecosystem.
Just to add one more thing on this issue of critical minerals, it's important, I think, to recognize that this is not purely an economic issue, that it's a strategic issue, certainly from the perspective of the Chinese leadership. And one of the reasons why we have not made more progress in getting away from our dependence on China for so many of these materials is that the Chinese authorities have manipulated prices in order to make it uneconomical for private sector actors in the United States and elsewhere to make the kind of investments that they need to make in order to produce alternative sources of supply. I think we've now recognized that, and some of what's happening involves setting price floors so that those who are making the investments can be assured that they will be able to sell what they produce at a price that will allow them to continue to make a profit. That's not a pure market solution. It's a strategic solution, in part again, in response to a strategy, a deliberate strategy that's being pursued by China.
Hi, I'm Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. I want to ask about the Philippines. One of your recommendations is to assist the Philippines in resisting Chinese aggression. I want to ask why the Philippines? I think the Biden administration identified India and Vietnam as the so-called swing states of the Indo-Pacific. Why does this commission see the Philippines as the country that you need to assist the most? You talk about bringing the Philippines into the Quad as a Quad Plus kind of arrangement. I think the Quad, Philippines is already in the so-called Squad, US, Japan, Australia, Philippines. What merits are there in bringing Philippines into the Quad? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. The Philippines is a treaty ally with the United States. It's probably our strongest supporter, strongest ally in Southeast Asia, and they're under intense pressure from the Chinese government, both in the South China Sea in terms of the incursions there, and also economically and with Chinese influence. You know, we have a long history, a beautiful history with the Philippines, and they are under pressure and pulling our support and has been a problem, and we need to send a very clear signal to the Philippines, to the people, and to the government that the U.S. supports them, and then back that up with our actions.
I would just add that the Philippines offers pretty crucial strategic real estate, whether you're thinking about a competition for influence in the South China Sea or a potential contingency in and around Taiwan. And so support for the Philippines on the issue where its sovereignty is most critically imperiled is part of a larger package of trying to shore up America's position across the larger region.
I agree with all those comments. They're spot on. We also have a recommendation related to Taiwan where we suggest that Taiwan open up a foreign military sales case where they can actually contribute to U.S. force posture initiatives in the region. So in other words, Taiwan could help pay for the development of ectosites in northern Luzon because they are directly related to deterrence and the U.S. ability to defend Taiwan if the political decision was made to do so. So the Philippines is absolutely great ally, supportive, key strategic real estate, but also of interest to other friends and partners of the United States.
Hello, hi, I'm Tolu from Carnegie Mellon University. This question is mainly research-based. I have two of them. With regards to university research, have you found that it is making its way through channels sanctioned through countries via China? And the report mentions the Autel Robotics establishing a Russian drone production facility. Could you explain briefly about the Autel Robotics, and have there been any research collaboration involving them or any universities that come up?
Anyone want to jump in? We haven't spent a lot of time on universities per se, but.
I think one of the things that I'll sort of zoom out on your question a little bit. I'm sorry to do that to you. I think that the observation of the commission really over the last decade and probably beyond is that there is a persistent effort by the Chinese government and its intelligence services to steal intellectual property from universities, from businesses, and from any entity that it finds value in. And so this is something the Commission's documented for a long time in an area where we continue to keep a close eye on things.
Hi. Cool. Thanks for taking our questions. I'm Travis Brubaker. I'm at E3G, which is a climate and geopolitics think tank. Region where we see that really most intertwined is the Indo-Pacific, specifically the Pacific Island Forum, which recently came out and said that climate change is the #1 national security interest for most of those countries. I was wondering if you could speak to that, and then how that might impact U.S. influence in the region. Thanks.
I think the Chinese sprint to electrification and the ecosystem that comes up around that, the industrial capacity to build, everything from batteries to solar cells and beyond, is something that we focused on in our energy hearing this year. I think Commissioner Goodwin, and I don't remember who his Republican colleague was on that commission, or that particular hearing, but sort of highlighted a lot of the issues that you just walked through. It is something that also got talked about in our supply chain hearing as well. And it has really allowed the Chinese to acquire everything from material science to materials to sort of the know-how to build and make more efficient batteries, more efficient solar cells. And it's really enabled them to then export that essentially to other countries that are sort of share their view on electrification and the urgency with which it needs to be pursued. Now, they're also talking out of sort of both sides of their mouth. We continue to see the Chinese build more coal plants than anyone else in the world. So, they're sort of having their cake and eating it too in this space. And so that's something that we're keeping a close eye
on. Certainly want to echo those sentiments, and that is an issue of paramount importance in the Pacific Islands, but it can't be divorced, as Commissioner Kuiken said, from these other initiatives that the PRC has going on. And it follows a familiar refrain: massive state support to support domestic initiatives, in this instance, the electrification of their economy. But it also serves a broader objective, which is to transform their industrial base and their manufacturing base and to gain advantage into energy markets and the manufacture of advanced energy and clean energy components. And then, of course, they use that leverage to gain advantage and ultimately control or dominance in global supply chains. So the question is, what are we going to do? How do we build resiliency into our supply chain and that of our allies and partners, especially with regard to the grid and critical energy infrastructure, given the potential for espionage and disruption? We even heard from one witness that the concern with regard to certain components in grid infrastructure shouldn't simply be contemplated as part of isolated incidents of cyber theft or cyber espionage. Instead, viewed as part of a broader objective by the PRC to pre-position disruptive capabilities into our grid, certainly risk that the U.S. simply cannot afford to take.
Let me just chime in here. Climate change is an existential threat to the existence of Pacific Island countries. It is central to their priorities and what's important. The U.S. has traditionally supported these programs in terms of mitigation and other climate change priorities, and our recommendation gets into that in terms of supporting those programs.
Another somewhat related question online. The Commission's energy recommendations are focused on cybersecurity. In a sector as broad as energy, why did the Commission focus on cybersecurity?
Well, again, just given the risk. Again, referring to the witness that testified before us at our energy hearing, the notion of potential disruption, especially of internet-connected devices and devices could be remotely accessed, are simply risks that the U.S. can't afford to take with regard to critical energy infrastructure, especially as demand for electricity is growing in the United States. And as demand grows, that's going to place increasing strain on our existing infrastructure and create the need for expansion. As we grow and expand to meet this growing demand, we need to pay attention to these security concerns. And it follows a familiar theme, as we've talked about with regard to biotech and quantum and other recommendations throughout the report. Identify dependencies, map our supply chains, identify dependencies, then try to build resiliency. And that's going to take investment. And that's going to take investment in universities, as Commissioner Friedberg said, in advanced manufacturing, in American workers, in education and workforce development, and in critical supply chains.
There's also a link between cybersecurity and potential military or political crises the United States might face vis-a-vis China. It seems altogether probable to me that at the outset of a Taiwan contingency, for instance, China might try to immobilize the United States through cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, including energy infrastructure. And so that's another reason to front load that part of the challenge.
Hi, Michele Mancuso, Washington International Trade Association. I had a question regarding Chinese security and military involvement in Southeast Asia, specifically their inside-out approach into embedding themselves into the internal security apparatuses of mainland Southeast Asian countries. I wanted to ask, what is the end goal or objective for China in doing this, and what are the implications for the United States?
Well, the Chinese have increasingly used the PLA as another arm of their diplomacy and attempts to create influence and leverage. I should have said that in reverse, to create leverage which turns into influence. And so the police training is but one part of the activities in the region. They have military training. They invite military officers to study in some of the Chinese military education programs. They have ship visits. They have other types of engagement, and they seek influence to have political impact so that these countries will lean more towards Beijing's preferences across a range of issues, to include security issues. They are also working on greater access to differing levels of success. I think in Cambodia, they were very close and perhaps are at the point where they're able to have access to a naval base that is exclusive and readily available, even though the Constitution of Cambodia would forbid a foreign base on their territory. So I think they understand that this is a competitive space and that the PLA needs, the access and the relationships to better their position there. I think there are second and third order effects of this as well. Obviously, they have an authoritarian system inside China where the security apparatus is empowered, equipped, trained to be a very oppressive force and to underscore the authoritarian regime's leadership and contribute to the stability of that leadership position. Obviously, how they train security forces in some of these countries are to underscore the same principles, give them the same capabilities. So across Southeast Asia, some of the countries are less than democratic, and unfortunately, I think China's contributions to their internal security forces will be a destabilizing impact for anyone who would like to see greater democracy, freedom, human rights in these countries.
I think we also found, I believe in the case of scam centers in particular, that there's a sort of ironic loop that some of the problems that countries in Southeast Asia are experiencing that might require additional support with intelligence, police, and so on, are in fact caused or originate in China. So there are Chinese organized crime families that are involved in setting up the scam centers, involved in drug trafficking, and so on in a number of countries in Southeast Asia. And the presence of those gangs and their activities has then been one of the reasons why the Chinese government is able to go to the local authorities and say, wouldn't you like some help? We'll train your police, or we'll provide you with security equipment and so on. So China is sometimes the origin of the problem as well as purporting to be the source of the solution.
Another question from online. Your recommendation covers military, civil, and commercial space efforts the United States needs to make in order to maintain ahead of China in space. Which one of these areas has China developed the fastest and most significantly in the past couple of years?
Sorry. We had a hearing on space this year. Commissioner Sims, who is unfortunately not here today, was my co-chair. This is an area where I used this analogy yesterday, which is the United States has an incredible space program, whether it's the civilian program, the military program, or the intelligence program. All of this has been something we built essentially over the last 70, 80 years since the Sputnik moment, the original Sputnik moment. And so the U.S. space program is sort of humming along, sort of 60, 70 miles down a highway. The Chinese just got started, probably 5, 10, 15 years ago. Their car is racing down the road at 115 miles an hour. So they may have started behind us, but they're coming up fast. We heard from General Saltzman. I think he used the word mind-boggling when describing the Chinese military space program. And that's launch, that's manufacturing, that's deployment of satellites into space. And it's the entire infrastructure sort of layer that allows for launch, allows for all of the development in this area. And so it's something where the Commission had done some work in 2019, and this is really continuing that work. We have a recommendation here related to space that highlights some of these issues, particularly on the infrastructure side and particularly on the launch side. One of the areas that we also talk about is something General Saltzman highlighted, which the creation of the Space Force was an important step, but there needs to be resourcing that goes along with that. And that's an area where we're sort of recommending a reallocation of resources to the Space Force. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but it's something that the Congress, we are urging them to sort of take a close look at. Hopefully that answered your question.
So I actually want to add something onto that, Reva. So in addition to everything Mike just laid out, which is absolutely on point, the CCP is leveraging civil and military. So this gets to kind of back to the question. They don't just have a military application here, they're leveraging both. That's part of the way. It's all funded by the government, or largely funded by the government, and it's allowing them to transform at an incredibly rapid pace. And so agree with sort of the recommendation there at the end. We've also got to recognize the fact that they're doing this, and this gets back to something Commissioner Miller touched on earlier, is we've got to make sure that the United States and entities here in the United States aren't helping sort of those civil components speed up faster by financing them.
We got plenty of online questions, so I'll keep going. The report discusses how China is flooding the rest of the world with exports. Given the WTO and other trade agreements, can other countries do anything about that? What policies does the Commission recommend to address this problem?
So the report contains several recommendations related to how the United States can better coordinate with our allies and partners related to the pernicious activity that we see with respect to China and their trade activity and their export policies, including elements that the WTO itself recognizes related to allowing countries to work with third-party nations when they see dumping and subsidies in those markets. The United States is a big market, but our firms need to be able to export to the world, and when they face subsidies in third-party countries, they are unable to sell into those markets because of the non-market conditions that China creates. And so there needs to be, in the Commission's view, better coordination with respect to trade activities. We saw a bit of that in the previous administration related to electric vehicles and coordinated activity between the United States and Canada and Europe related to some of those items, and there's certainly opportunity for more there.
If I could just add on that, this is an area where cooperation between the United States and other countries is really critical if there's going to be anything resembling an effective way of responding to China's enormous outpouring of manufactured goods. So there's a link between the China Shock 2.0 and the requirement for cooperation in imposing some uniform barriers on Chinese exports, which are subsidized and therefore underpriced. If only the United States raises protective barriers, those goods are going to flow into the markets of other countries and do damage to them, including to our friends and allies. So cooperation is really essential to deal with this problem.
Hi, I have one more question, and I will introduce myself. My name is Mark. I'm from United Daily News, based in Taiwan. Just one more question is on the chips, because President Trump has on multiple occasions talks about diversification of chip manufacturing and semiconductor manufacturing, shifting the production from Taiwan back to United States. I'm just wondering what's a good balance of the, chip manufacturing of those production in United States and Taiwan, because Taiwan also keep those production as part of its economic deterrence. So I'm just wondering what's a good balance. Thank you.
Glad to start. Look, we as a country have an advantage when it comes to the contest on AI as it relates to China, and that's due to chips. And that's why you see in the report, both with the economic statecraft recommendation as well as kind of bolstering existing controls at BIS, why that's so important. The question is, where would we be right now without controls over the last several years, even starting with the first Trump administration and through the last administration? Where would we be vis-a-vis China and AI without those controls? I think you've seen with the Congress over the last half a dozen years recognize the strategic importance of onshoring chip manufacturing in this country, and that's what you see executed through largely the CHIPS and Science Act, a bipartisan bill. I think there's a lot to be, there's still a lot to do on that front, both in the terms of execution, and I think finding that balance between producing the advanced chips here in this country and having the capacity to sustain that while supporting our allies like Taiwan. We have benefit from a strong supply chain when it comes to chips, and thanks in part to Taiwan, also the Netherlands, Japan. These are really important recommendations that that this commission has looked at and will continue to. I don't know if my colleagues have more to add. Since we're on the export control BIS chip topic, I do want to shift everyone's attention to what my colleague was referring to. We do have a number of recommendations related to export controls and to semiconductors. One of the things this administration is intending to do is increasing the proliferation of the American stack across the world, around the world. Now, what that does at the same time is mean that you have to play a lot more defense. If you're sending your technology all around the world and more aggressively, then you also have to play defense more aggressively. We could just raise our hand and say the Bureau of Industry and Security needs more money and they need more manpower. They need more resources. Of course, that's true. But we were also trying to be a little bit more creative. And so some of the things that we suggested in our recommendation have to do with technological ways of regaining some of the advantages that we can potentially lose if we're not careful. One of them is chip tracking technology, so that we know if a bunch of chips are being diverted to places they shouldn't be going, then we'll be able to track that. Seems rather a no-brainer to a lot of people, but maybe not. Another one of them is that we should reevaluate the entire model of how we sell our advanced chips. So we sell chips right now, where they physically go over a border, they disappear, we lost them forever. One of the things that we have asked Congress to consider is pushing to change the model from a sell model to a rental model, which would mean that it would be accessible, advanced chips would be accessible via the cloud, but they could be turned on and off if we thought that they shouldn't be going in a certain direction. There'd be know your customer regulations that would be at play, but essentially what we are suggesting doing is reclaiming lost leverage. So instead of losing the leverage of selling a chip and letting it go into the ether, we don't know where it is, we don't know what it's doing. We'd say, look, we're gonna maintain control over these advanced chips. It'll be a political decision which chips we sell, but once we decide which chips we sell, we'll be doing it through a rental model, and that'll allow us to maintain a leverage all the way through.
I'd just like to ask my colleagues if there are any issues that haven't been raised that you particularly had wanted to make sure we bring up as we spread out to go bring our report across Congress. Anyone else have anything that hasn't already been raised? I think we've covered most of our recommendations. Okay, hearing none, I want to thank all of you for coming, and for those of you who've been listening or watching online. Again, all of our materials can be found at uscc.gov, and both the executive summary, the full report, and all of the other research materials on Made in China 2025, sanctions. We will have one on quantum in the coming days. All can be found at our website. So thank you all, and we are adjourned.